How did David Lynch write his screenplays? Well, today I'm going to be doing a deep dive into Lynch's writing process because David Lynch is an underrated screenplay writer. And if you look at Lynch's movies, he wrote or co wrote every single one of his feature films outside of the straight story. But I very rarely hear people talking about his literary talent. And of course, we are going to be hearing from the chairman of the board, Mr. David Lynch himself, on his writing process. But as I'm sure you guys know, Lynch is very vague about his praxis. He likes to create this persona of this mystical methodology that, in actuality, as I'm about to show you guys today, isn't true. Because we'll talk about David Lynch's actual scripts and the evolution from his first draft to the fifth draft, and then how it all ended up in his movies. Because that's how you really track someone's artistic process. And so reducing it to, you don't just have to worry about it, you just have to meditate and catch the big fish. It's all common sense, let it come out, actually makes it harder for upcoming artists to utilize what David Lynch learned to help transform the world further. And so before we get too deep in the weeds, let me introduce myself really fast. My name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about David Lynch. If you look at the playlist down below, you will see an ever-blossoming library on David Lynch's movies, his artistic philosophy, and his life. And I expect over the next couple years to publish hundreds of videos on Lynch. And so subscribe if you are interested. And hey, enough from me. Let us now hear from Lynch. I met Frank Daniels at the American Film Institute, who was dean of the School for Advanced Film Studies, and he taught a way to do it. You get yourself a pack of 3x5 cards, and you write a scene on each card, and when you have 70 scenes, you have a feature film. So in each card, you write the heading of the scene, and then the next card, then the second scene, then the third scene. So you have 70 cards, each with the name of the scene. Then you flesh out each of the cards and walk away. You've got a script. But that's not exactly what Lynch did. And Lynch talking about his own process now, quote, "For 7 years, I ate at Bob's Big Boy. I would go out at 2:30 after the lunch rush. I ate a chocolate shake and 4, 5, 6, 7 cups of coffee with lots of sugar. And there's lots of sugar in that chocolate shake. It's a thick shake in a silver goblet. I would get a rush from all this sugar, and I would get so many ideas. I would write them on these napkins. It was like I had a desk with paper. All I had to do was remember to bring my pen, but a waitress would give me one if I remembered to return it at the end of my stay. I got a lot of ideas at Bob's." And so we've all probably heard this before. You guys have probably seen these quotes before. This is nothing shocking. But if we look at both quotes, the first quote, Lynch heard about using index cards. And in this circumstance, and at Bob's Big Boys, Lynch did write multiple scripts. He would use napkins in the place of index cards and be coming up with these ideas for these scenes that he was working on, and obviously organizing them later. But now we need to slow this entire process down, because if we are actually going to utilize this information to change the world, to use our own art, or to support other artists who are going to change the world, this is actually going to lead a lot of people astray, because we have to examine the causal factors of Lynch's philosophy that enabled him to succeed with this type of mentality, and with the technical writing strategies we'll be talking about in a second that he utilized. So Lynch was born in Missoula, Montana, and lived in Boise and Sandpoint, Idaho. And many of us think of Boise, Idaho today as a nice hipster place. That's kind of the liberal city of Idaho. But Sandpoint, Idaho, Missoula, Boise, back in the 1950s, were pretty rugged and rural. And so Lynch, who was an Eagle Scout, was first educated in nature. We see Lynch now living on Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills in his tuxedo, smoking cigs and sleeping with beautiful actresses. And he somewhat seems divorced from nature, but he was built in the original world and impetus for imagination. And then, as you guys know, he lived in Boston and Philadelphia, and then saw the other side of the aisle. He experienced the city and terror. But from a young age, Lynch focused on his artistic process. He talked about how he had 3 separate lives: his family life, his artistic life, and his school life, all the way back in high school. And when Lynch was painting and working on the studio when he was younger, he had, to quote him, a room to dream. He had the space to do it. And Lynch says of this, "The world is getting noisier and more frantic in the atmosphere. And so even sitting still is a problem. My friend Bushnell Keeler always said, You need to have 4 hours of uninterrupted time to do 1 hour of good painting. If you are rushed, you just can't think and do it. You've got to really fall in deep and go to this place where you catch ideas, but it really takes sitting still. And so many artists don't have this stillness. Many artists have their Apple Music or their Spotify going, and there's stuff going wrong. Maybe you have a family like I do, and there's always chaos going on. And if you know David Lynch's thoughts on music, he says that he only listens to music when he can listen to music. He doesn't listen to music and write. He listens to music and just sits there and listens. Doesn't look at his phone, doesn't do chores. And so with Lynch, we have a very deliberate and focused individual. And with everyone's excuse, everyone's got anxiety and ADD and ADHD and whatever other excuse they have for not being able to sit down and focus for 4+ hours. But if you read Deep Work by Cal Newport, if you look at any of the greatest authors of all time or any of the greatest authors, there are outliers, but most of them get inside a room and are in there almost every single day for 4+ hours at a time. And so I'm only mentioning this because with David Lynch, it seems like the mystique is that he just sits and these ideas come to him. But he has built a deliberate life. If anyone, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen, the movie David Lynch, The Artistic Life or whatever it's called. And you've heard about his dedication to art, but he's had multiple wives. He's left multiple of his kids behind and really sacrificed to make art the number one priority in his life from day one. At some level, he killed himself by smoking so many cigs because that just fueled his focus even more. That's one of the things that tobacco enables you to do is just sit and drive. And when Lynch was writing Twin Peaks: The Return, Mary Sweeney says this about his dedication. During the period that he was writing with Mark Frost, he'd come home every night, and because I didn't like him smoking in the house, he'd sit outside and smoke and write on legal pads. He'd sit out there for hours. He spent so much time out there on this vintage lounge chair that we had to have a new cushion made up for it. On cold nights, he'd be bundled up in a blanket. There was an overhang on our house. When it rained, he'd turn his chair sideways so he wouldn't get wet. And so this now brings us to a very important point in terms of David Lynch's writing to kind of pull away the mystique, because I have read most of David Lynch's scripts. And one thing that I've noticed is that his scripts are actually very lengthy. Most of his screenplays run over 30,000 words in total, and some of them creep closer to 40,000 words. And for those who don't know, first of all, that is a novella length piece of writing, but most screenplays fall around the 20,000 word mark, and very rarely are they reaching toward 40,000. And from what I can tell, David Lynch would, on average, write anywhere from 3 to 5 drafts of his script before he would get on the set. And obviously, sometimes he'd be collaborating with others on those scripts. And so doing 3 or 5 drafts with the dedication I'm hearing about here on a 30,000 word script means that David Lynch was putting thousands of hours, at least 1,000, I would put that over 2,000 for sure, hours into his screenplays. And those are dedicated hours. Like I said, that isn't just like unfocused time. And for some of his bigger projects, like Twin Peaks: The Return and Twin Peaks, he had co-writers, which made it easier to kind of bear that load. And so that's a beautiful amount of dedication. David Lynch would put more time into one of his scripts, which wasn't even the final product, more than the average person who calls himself a novelist in 2025. And as you heard me just saying, Lynch's scripts were fairly long. And when you read them, and if you, an exercise for the Lynchians out there or the nerds out there like me is read the script as you are watching one of his movies. And first of all, it's a beautiful way to see like what he imagined and what he intuited on set and like kind of came up with. But you'll also see that he had a lot of the colors, a lot of the moods, a lot of the actual scenes and the dialogue all laid out before he got there. And when you look at his scripts, they are, in my opinion, pretty well put together, pretty logical. And it's almost antithetical to this idea of this kind of artist who's sitting and writing on the napkins on a sugar high, just coming up with all this stuff, and he shows up on the set. That's kind of the image that most of us have of Lynch. But in actuality, his scripts were very well polished. And so Lynch has said before that the script is just getting all these ideas down so that you can remember them for when you actually get on the set. And what I kind of see as what Lynch is doing here, and what I would call, I wouldn't say maximalist, but a pretty heavily detailed script, is that Lynch wants everything taken care of. He wants, when he gets on set, to have a space and have everything laid out so he has another room to dream when he's on set for these super long hours that you hear he would be working and meditating and doing these things. Because he has the script, because he has all that down, he doesn't have to worry about all those little small details anymore. What he has to worry about is bringing in the artistic and kind of the other elements that can only be seen when you're on set with these actors and actresses. And Mark Frost, who co-wrote Twin Peaks with David Lynch, said of how they wrote together, quote, "We'd toss things in the air and bat them back and forth like a game of ping pong. Scenes would suggest themselves, and we'd hammer them into shape. And there were certain characters that one or the other of us had the voice for more authoritatively. Structure might be a little bit more of my strong suit, but David's got tremendously enhanced ideas about mood and character and small details and behaviors that are indelible and unique." And so now let's talk about contrast, because David Lynch's writing, like actual writing and his dialogue, is very, very interesting because Lynch is a painter first and foremost. He is an artist. He is a photographer that got into film and then writing. And so when you read David Lynch's screenplays, when you actually read his dialogue, it is somewhat simple. Like we all know, like the little one-liners, "Where's Hap? He's dead. Good and dead." And it almost feels like to me, you guys, that it almost felt like a slog or somewhat like work for David Lynch to be writing these actual lines of dialogue. That Lynch wasn't necessarily interested as much in writing these scripts as the moment and the directing itself, because he has the colors, he has these things. And when you see Lynch get excited in his screenplays, it's when he is talking about like how people are dressed, in Twin Peaks, The Return, when Laura and Donna go with the men. That's a spoiling thing to like the weird metal band. David Lynch describes it. On the stage, a three-piece hell metal band is building up toward oblivion. The lead singer is dressed in a buffalo skin complete with at least half the buffalo head and horns. But this is important for Lynch to have autonomy over his characters because he wants to know them. And so they seemingly start as these vessels that are a beautiful way to use as contrast for when he gets in person, because none of the weird additions and idiosyncrasies exist in his scripts. For instance, the whole in dream section of Blue Velvet. And I'm going to talk about this in tomorrow's video, hopefully. I'm going to talk about his usage and what all that means in Blue Velvet, Roy Orbison's In Dreams. But all of that wasn't in the original script. All that manifested later on. But when I read his drafts, like I said, I'm sitting here calling David Lynch simple and all this stuff, and that it's not that complicated. But from draft 1 to draft 5, he spends so much time on these little small evolutions and on creating this world so that he can live it. It's a brilliant idea that for an intuitive, that if you immerse yourself in the world and then let it gestate, let it grow inside of you, that when you finally get there, it's almost like you're in this beautiful garden and you can pick whatever you want. You have all this rocket fuel for ascension. And Lynch doesn't need special effects or anything else to make that happen. He only needs his own intuition. And so let's talk about that. When Lynch shows up on the set and is meditating, he's either doing two things. He is either diving deep inside his own self and this world that he's created and pulling out kind of these best possible realities, these really idiosyncratic ideas that work beautifully with the piece of art, or he has spent so much time with this and he's created such a good base. He's almost like a Wi-Fi signal that's really strong and it's opened up, and he's tapping into the creative ether, the collective unconscious or whatever, and getting the perfect ideas about these characters. Whatever one you believe, whether art comes from within or from without, doesn't really matter. But this is great because most intuitives do not do this. Most intuitive artsy people who have talents like David Lynch sit and make us look at their navel-gazing art, make us look at this is my art, because it just came out of nowhere. And they're acting like David Lynch does on the set with none of the base, none of the foundations, none of the connection to nature and other art forms. And we haven't even talked about, and we won't in this video, just natural talent alone. And Lynch is a believer in scripts. He's a believer in this process. He says that, quote, "I think scripts are really good, but if they were perfect, you just release your script. You would just read it, and it's not that way." And something should be said of Lynch's failed project, Saliva Bubble, where he said about his script, What I wrote was pretty much worthless, but something happened inside me about structure, about scenes, and I don't even know what it was, but it sort of percolated down and became part of me. But the script was pretty much worthless. I knew I just watered it down. It was way more normal to me, the process of writing scripts. And so if you are wanting to be like David Lynch or dive into this world, the best thing you can do in any medium of writing is finish something in full, even if it sucks. And that is going to show you the internal process and the internal journey for you to find the structure and the scenes you need and the voice that's going to make your stuff unique. All that stuff needs to be worked out early. And what's great about that is that if you have that mentality, I call it writing for the trash, and you just kind of blow through something, then it's really easy to write. There's no pressure. No one has to read it. I have a friend who really didn't want to go the self-publishing route, and she didn't get published until her 10th novel. She spent over a decade just grinding, but she learned a ton of lessons along the way. And to reiterate one more time, relaxation is so important when writing because Lynch says you always have to leave an opening for other forces, to do their thing. When you're on your own, just writing these things down, it's so limited, and you want to somehow open it up and throw it out and let other things intervene. And so there you have it. My name is Ian. This is Right Conscious. We talk about David Lynch. That's my general outline of how Lynch gets it done. If you guys want to see more videos on Lynch, once again, go check out the podcast playlist down below, and I'll see you in the next video.